So first things first, who are you, what's your role, and where do you work?
I'm Ole Lensmar. I'm the CTO at Testkube, and I'm working out of my home here in Stockholm, Sweden.
Fantastic. What are 3 Kubernetes emerging tools that you're keeping an eye on?
3 Kubernetes emerging tools. I'm keen on Kubernetes itself because the product we build is very kind of low level integrated with with Kubernetes. And I think I'm keeping an eye on AI related tooling in the space because I think that's just going to move things forward. However skeptical you might be, that's just coming. And then I think interesting around configuration management, Helm, Customize, those kind of tools. And maybe also ephemeral environment tooling, which I think is super interesting and also very adjacent to testing, what we're working with. So that was actually 4. So I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. But if you wouldn't mind, because we're hearing so much about AI every single day, could you drill down a little bit more on the kind of AI testing tools that you've been working with, what your experience has been, if you have any recommendations regarding them?
So testing and AI in testing comes with a lot of flavors. I think a lot of initial stabs are using AI to generate tests, which makes sense because tests are code. Most of the modern test tooling is very code oriented. So, test is code. If you're using Playwright or Cypress or writing unit tests or K6, which is also, basically scripting. So that's one way we're seeing people creating more tests because like all testing, getting just those initial tests, scaffolds, everything running is just easier with AI. Obviously, you still need someone to kind of then put in heart to it and make sure that the right things. I think the other areas which are interesting is around helping you with then scheduling the right tests and then on the end of it is helping you remediate failed tests. So an AI can help you figure out, why did the test fail? It can look at logs, it can look at code changes, it can look at configuration in your cluster, and from that deduce kind of what was the cause of that test failure, which can be a very cumbersome, especially in Kubernetes, because you might have, distributed application all spread out. There's a bunch of tidbits hidden in your APM solution or in your traces or whatever. And AI is really great at kind of weeding through that and helping you maybe narrow down. So I think that's kind of the areas where we see people initially approaching, but it's still an early field and it's super exciting to see where that goes.
One of our podcast guests, Steven, thinks you can't really expect that testing your application in a dev or QA cluster prepares you for production because production is always different. What's your approach to performance testing?
Well, so performance testing, I think, is also, like many areas, is a pretty vast field, right? So in performance testing, I think my approach is that you need to do it early in your life, reasonably early in your life cycle. And of course, the infrastructure that you might be running performance tests on early isn't the same as you have in production, which is where I think where that comment came from. Because in production, you'll have a very different capacity, you'll have much more different security constraints, and you'll have, throttling limits if you're using third-party tools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's hard maybe to take account for when you're testing pre-production, but you still need to test pre-production. You can do soak testing, which means that you're not maybe loading at massive load, but just making sure that, your application can handle continuous load over longer times. You should also be running performance tests simultaneously as other tests. I think this is super important. So if you're running security tests, you're running functional tests, you're running compliance tests, acceptance tests, do that at the same time as you're running a soak test, right? Put a basic load of 100 users or whatever, and then run your functional tests or security tests at the same time, because often that load will off-put the behavior of your system, both functionally, but it could also, make it less secure. So I think that's really a really important thing. And we see that a lot with customers. You can even combine multiple different types of load tests, right? Creating different types of profiles. One's soak test, which has a basic load, and doing spike testing where you jam 1,000 users for 10 seconds and then just see how your system recovers. It's almost like chaos testing, but not really. So I think what's important is to try different strategies with load profiles, to run your load tests in parallel with other types of tests, and of course, just like the question you said or the claim that you had, just because it works in staging doesn't mean the load performance is gonna hold in production. It should, of course, but production is ultimately usually more constrained or different. Long answer.
Now, our another guest of ours, Andre, suggested that Flux CD is more approachable to administrators, whereas Argo CD is more about interacting with developers. Do you agree? And in addition to that, what's your advice when it comes to implementing GitOps?
Yeah, I think Flux CD to me seems more like a a toolbox for building GitOps workflows, whereas Argo CD is a more an opinionated, and I don't mean that in a bad way, approach to how to do GitOps. So I definitely, I can see that Argo CD can appeal to people just wanting to get, hit the ground running with GitOps, while someone more experienced might want to fine tune exactly how things are going to play out in a more complex GitOps deployment in a more complex organization. And I think, so I agree with that statement. I think what's important with GitOps is really to understand what you're getting into and the consequences of that for your development pipelines, for your deployment pipelines, and for your organization, and for how that kind of does require a mindset, like all kind of change shifts like this, right? It does require people to think a little bit differently, maybe about how you can deploy and how often you deploy. And then, of course, with my background, how does that play into testing? Because with GitOps, you're basically going into an asynchronous deployment pipeline, often at least, versus previously having a more synchronous monolithic approach to CI/CD. And then how do you tie testing and test execution into that in an efficient way? So I think that's also something to be mindful of. Even if you're an ops person, you might think, well, testing is not really my problem. I just make sure things work. But ultimately, if you want to run a lot of tests and you want to validate that every GitOps sync is validated, is tested correctly, and that could be infrastructure testing, it could be load testing like we talked about earlier, it can be functional testing. You'll need to figure out, where do I inject those tests at a good time so they don't slow down, so they don't overload. I just talked to a customer a week ago who had a one big app or GitHub repo they were syncing, and for every small sync that was kicking off tests, and they didn't really want that. They wanted to be more granular. So there's definitely things to consider around the consequences of adopting GitOps for other things in your deployment pipeline as well. So,
and on the subject of GitOps, because it's part and parcel of this, in our recent insights report, we saw that configuration management was the number one area that practitioners engage with in terms of the content that we're looking at. From a technical perspective, why do you think that configuration management stands out so much in Kubernetes? And what challenges do teams face when trying to keep configuration reliable and consistent across environments?
I think that the challenge with configuration managers is that it's so easy to just spin up infrastructure. And how do you, to your point, how do you keep that consistent? How do you manage that consistency across clusters, across nodes, across everything that you're deploying, and how do you manage the life cycle of your configurations, and that together with the applications that are running in your infrastructure. So I can definitely see that that's a challenge as you grow, as you start generating ephemeral environments for testing. Back to testing, and as you kind of build, maybe you're a platform engineering team which kind of provisions, if temporary infrastructure for your teams, and suddenly you end up with all these clusters, and they're all running different versions of Kubernetes. Because Kubernetes evolves pretty quickly, and and sometimes clusters can stay around for a long time. So, and over time you have a configuration drift. So I think there's just a lot of complexity around configuration management. I mean, configuration management is not new for Kubernetes. I think it's one of those practices that has been around, as long as the SDLC has been. If you go back 30, 40 years, it's just different types of configurations, and the challenges are maybe the same. But I think with maybe also then with the introduction of GitOps, which provides a means for configuration management as Git as your source of truth, which is super interesting because it adds so much on top of that. But I still think people are trying to figure out what are the best practices. How do we not come into a situation where configurations drift? I mean, which when it happens can be a really pain to unwind.
And Kubernetes turned 10 years old last year. What can you expect? What should we expect in the next 10 years to come?
I think Kubernetes has been great at adapting to user needs, I guess my expectation is that it continues to do so pretty aggressively. I can that at a higher level, and I'm sure it's going to continue following like industry trends, and which I think is great. I think that's it's a somewhat high level generic prediction. I don't have any predictions specifically on, CRDs or like resource types, whatever might happen. But I think just at a strategic level, I think it's been great to see Kubernetes evolve pretty quickly. We're still in a space that is evolving quickly, and there's, people are getting, well, you mentioned GitOps, and now we have AI, and I'm sure we'll have something else new and shiny in the 2 or 3 years. And so I'm expecting Kubernetes to kind of keep up there, and I'm excited to see how that.
Fantastic. Like you said, predictions can be tricky, but you do know one thing that's for sure. What's going to be happening in KubeCon?
KubeCon is going to be it's going to be awesome as always, and we are organizing Cube Jam, and I have been practicing heavily on my guitar to get my tapping techniques into place, right? So I hope to do an eruption style solo this time around with heavy distortion, and hopefully you on the stage as well, Bart. That would be awesome.
I hope to be there. We will hope to channel all the Van Halen energy possible in Atlanta with all the other wonderful folks that'll be there at Cube Jam. Definitely check it out. We'll be sharing more news about that as well on Cube events. Good. And are there any other projects that you have going on that we should know about that are coming up in the next few months?
No, well, I think the most interesting thing on the Testkube world is that we've just launched our MCP server, and we're just seeing, especially from customers, some amazing workflows that they're building around remediation and stuff like that. And we're doing a webinar soon to show how that works. So I'm super excited about that, actually, because I think it'll add a lot of value to our offering and will make life much easier for our users.
I also understand you have a podcast. Is that correct?
We do have a podcast, the Cloud Native Testing Podcast. It's been, I think we have like 15 episodes out now. It's been really great. I'll share one super interesting thing from there is that maybe going back to actually one of the questions you asked about before, testing in production is one of those things that most people kind of say it's a no-no, but I would swear that about 80-90% of the people we've had on the podcast all do testing in production and see it as something that's actually key to their testing strategy, because you need to make sure that things don't fall between the cracks, and it's a great complement to testing pre-production. So I think that was super interesting to hear on that show, and talking to the people that we've been talking to, and it just shows that the academic world might say you should not test in production. In real life, that's actually what most people do, and it works perfectly fine.
Ole, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
LinkedIn, or you can just email me, ole@testkube.io, and I'm super open to chatting about stuff.
You heard it here first, folks. Ole, always a pleasure to talk to you, and look forward to seeing you very soon at KubeCon. Best of luck with the podcast, and we'll be in touch. Take care.
Take care.